Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's time to get started here. I have a small presentation that I prepared, but actually there is not that much on it this time because most of this presentation or webinar is going to be a demonstration. But there is an agenda here where you can see that we're going to talk about page boxes, specifically in the examples the trim box, but where it says trim box you could actually replace any other page box in pdfToolbox. We're going to talk about page boxes, and the principal subject is how to remove objects outside of a page box. And the fact that you see 3 times the same thing on this slide is not a mistake. It means that there are many different ways in pdfToolbox to accomplish this particular task, and what I've prepared is a look at the different ways this can be accomplished and some supporting technology around that. So today's webinar is not just focused on answering the question, how do I remove things outside of a particular page box, but it's really more designed to show you a number of the technologies in pdfToolbox that will work with page boxes and let you accomplish this particular thing. And that's the end of the presentation part, which is good. So I can get rid of this and we will look at pdfToolbox instead. Meanwhile, this is a webinar, so you cannot speak up. You're all muted, but if you have questions, there is a GoToWebinar control panel where normally you should have an area to ask questions. You can type your question in there. So if something comes up that isn't exactly clear, don't hesitate, just put it in there, and at the end of the webinar I will look to see if there are any unanswered questions and then deal with them at that point. Okay, so let's look at this. I have pdfToolbox desktop in front of me. And the first point that is important is that if you want to follow along or you want to afterwards try to reproduce what I am doing here, you are going to need pdfToolbox Desktop 10, not version 9. Some of the techniques that I'm showing you will also work in version 9, but some of them, and I think from the list of Fixups that I'm looking at here, specifically 5 and 7 will only work in version 10 because they're based on Sifter or the context-aware object detection technology that was introduced with version 10. So what you have in front of you is a very silly document, of course. It has multiple pages and it comes out of, I don't know, probably Quark Express, if I remember correctly. But it's an empty document and it does have page boxes. Now, the first clue or the way you can see that there are page boxes is actually by these badges at the top of the screen. They'll show all of the different boxes. If you do not have that in your version of pdfToolbox, that is because it's switched off in the preferences. So when you go to preferences and you go to highlighting, there is an item here that is called visualization of page geometry boxes. And there are 2 options. The first one will simply show the boxes by themselves, but without these badges over it. And the second one will also show the name of these page geometry boxes. Now, if you remember what the colors are of the individual boxes, you can just as well switch off the name badges. For me, I always get confused if I do that, so I let that on. So what you can see here is that we have a bleed box, we also have an art box and a trim box. And the trim box, it's a little bit difficult to see, but the trim box is centered, of course, on the document, and it extends up to the trim marks that were placed in the document as well. The question that we're trying to answer today is, if you have objects that are completely outside of the trim box, how do you remove those objects from the document? And this question is very often asked because someone gets in a workflow, you get documents that have trim marks and bleed marks, but perhaps they are not all positioned correctly. So a very common thing to do could be to take all documents that come in, remove everything outside of the trim box, and then use pdfToolbox to apply your own trim marks that are optimized for a particular workflow, or even without requiring something that is really optimized, trim marks that are consistent with all documents in the workflow afterwards. So the first step of this process would be removing everything outside of the trim box, and because this is kind of a recurring question in support, we decided to answer it and show you what the different possibilities are. Now, before I do that, it is sometimes useful to precisely highlight what the trim box is. And in this document, of course, it's very obvious, because whoever designed this did not know how to design a proper document. It doesn't have any bleed in this particular case. It was actually me who designed it, and it was on purpose. But anyway, so in this particular document, it's easy to see. There are, of course, many documents where it is not that obvious where the trim box is. So before we start removing objects outside the trim box, we could consider making our life a little bit easier and try to make a fixup that highlights the page box. So I want something that will simply add a line or something else on top of the existing trim box, for example. How do I do that? Well, there are multiple ways it can be done. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. And let me just show you the first one. And that one, if you want to find the fixup that is used, the fixup is called outline page geometry boxes. This is a pretty old one. It has been in the product since pdfToolbox 8 or maybe even before. It's a relatively old fixup in here, and what it does is exactly what the name says. It allows you to put lines or a rectangle on top of the trim box. I'll actually more precisely on top of any of the page boxes that you want. So bleed, trim, art, or crawl box. What type of line? Well, that's completely customizable. So I can decide what the width of the line is, and if I want to make it very visible, I might actually make it a little bit thicker. I have the color space that is going to be used. So this one here is set to CMYK and cyan, magenta, yellow, black. So this is 100% magenta. I can then choose to create it as a spot color. I could put it on its own layer. And very interestingly, in this particular fixup, I can also decide which lines I want to create. So if I want to highlight only the top and the bottom, for example, then I could turn off the left and right side of the page box. So that's something that is quite unique to this fixup, and that can come in handy in some cases. And then I also have an offset for the lines that are created. So if I don't want them to be exactly on the trim box, but I want them, for example, the left line should be 10 millimeters to the left of the trim box or 10 millimeters inside of the trim box, then that can be accomplished as well. I would need to set this to millimeter in this point, and then I could set the value to what I want. The last option that you have is this apply to. And for people who have worked with pdfToolbox fixups for a while, this will be easy to recognize. But this is a filter that tells pdfToolbox on which pages this particular fixup will do its work. And well, I can use any preflight check that was created to help pdfToolbox figure out which page that is. If we want to do something very useful, we could, for example, work with the sequential page number. For example, I could say number 1, and we call this detect first page. And when I select that, then the adding of the trim box will only be done on the first page now. And of course, this can be modified to do exactly what you want. But in my example here, I'm going to continue to put it on all pages. So to see what this does, we can do two things. I can save this Fixup, and then I can go run it and save it on my desktop. Because I am in pdfToolbox 10, I am going to hit the test button instead, and that shows me the result of running this Fixup immediately. As you can see, a line was added that is 100% magenta all around the trim box, and the line is 5 points wide, and it is centered on the trim box. So if the offsets in this Fixup are 0, the default positioning is to put the line exactly on the trim box, and if, well, a line always has a certain width, and the line will be centered on the position of the trim box. So this can be a relatively useful Fixup for many different workflows. It doesn't always, you don't always have to think about, strictly speaking, highlighting a trim box, which is more of a debugging thing and probably not so much of a production thing. But assume that you have large format production workflows where you have banners and so on. In many cases they need folding lines and cutting lines to be added. Well, this Fixup would be perfect to add a magenta folding line and a cyan cutting line on the right sides of the banner, for example. So this can be used for debugging purposes, and that's more or less what I'm using it for here, but it could also be used in production workflows, for example, in large format. Now, this is a very nice way of doing things, but I have other options in pdfToolbox, and I wanted to show you a different way of highlighting a trim box that sometimes is a little bit more flexible, although it also has limitations. So both of these ways I'm showing you have advantages and disadvantages. In this particular case, I'm going to use create and apply shapes. The shapes technology is something that got added in pdfToolbox 9, and it is a way to create shapes. The shapes can be created from different elements. They can be created from a page box, or by tracing page content, or a custom box somewhere, or looking at a vector path. And then there is a very specific way from the what is called print service, which is part of the processing steps ISO standard, mostly for packaging workflows. I've selected a very simple way to create my shape. I'm creating it from the trim box. And then I can also have a little bit of adjustment here, but you can see already that there is a difference between the previous method and this one. In the previous method, I could choose which sides of the trim box I want to highlight. In this particular case, it's always going to be the complete trim box. I can adjust the size, so I could say make it a little bit smaller than the trim box, or a little bit bigger than the trim box, so that's a possibility. But I can't switch off the left side, for example. What I can do, which I couldn't do with the other method, is I can actually create a rounded corner in this case. And again, don't just think of this method as a debugging trick that we're using now for remove outside of trim box. Also think that this might have applications in other workflows. This rounded corner, for example, can be very useful if you start to use this technique to add cutting paths and so on. Many labels require a cutting path that is not a rectangle but a rounded rectangle, because that's much easier for cutting and afterwards being able to peel the label off the underlying substrate. So there are definitely production applications of this as well. And I'm going to leave this as a rounded rectangle just so that we see what the result is going to be. So I create a shape based on the trim box, and then I need to say how I want to apply that particular shape. And then you see what I selected here is stroked and filled in front of the current page content. So basically I'm going to add vector path that is stroked, but the inside is going to be filled as well. And then I have this long blob with parameters. If I click on the edit, it shows me all of the different things I can customize. Basically, I can customize the fill parameters and then the stroke parameters. And I've done more or less the same as for the previous Fixup, so 100% magenta again, both for fill and for stroke. But for the fill, I've set opacity to 30%, so that's going to be transparent. The stroke is 100%, so that's just opaque. And overprints on all of them, I create them as a spot color again, and so on and so on. To test this, we can do exactly the same thing. I can hit the test button, and that shows you what happens here. You have to look closely because it's a magenta fill on top of purple, which is probably not the wisest choice I could have made to make it visual. But you can still see that a stroke has been added on the outside in 100% magenta. There is a rounded corner here. You can see that very well at all of the corners. And the inside is now filled with a magenta color as well. So it accomplishes, or both methods that you see here accomplish more or less the same thing. However, due to the fact that these Fixups have different parameters, you can look at both of them to see which of the two would be most appropriate for what you want to accomplish in a particular workflow. There are certainly other ways you can do this as well. You could use apply or add content with the place content rather with an HTML template, but that would be creating a complete HTML template. For simply adding a rectangle is too much overkill in my book to even try to do. So I didn't want to go into that. So that's for the visualization part, where we highlight the trim box and so on. On the next subject is of course what we really want to talk about, which is remove objects outside trim box. Let's see what we're going to do for that. So I have three methods here, and in essence they all three are going to accomplish the same thing, but the way they accomplish it is a little bit different again, and they also have other advantages and disadvantages. So let's take the simplest one first. There is actually a Fixup that does this out of the box, and that's always good news. There is a Fixup called remove objects outside page area, and you can choose again the page box. You will notice that there is a page box missing. This is a small inconsistency. It is not really, at least I don't think there is a good reason for it, but in this particular Fixup I can choose trim box, bleed box, crop, and media. I could make this a test question, but the one that is missing here is Artbox, so you cannot select that one. Artbox is not used that often in workflows. If it is used and you want to do that, then you will have to use one of the other Fixups. In my case, I want to use the trim box, so it's not a problem at all. And I'm going to say remove objects completely outside of the trim box. You notice the same apply to, so I could again go into this apply to pull down and select a preflight check, and if I do this, then it would only remove objects outside of the trim box on the first page and not on subsequent pages. But let's not do that for this test, and let me show you what happens. Well, this is basically what happens when I run this. So on each page, all objects that are completely outside of the trim box are simply removed. So it removed all of the trim and bleed marks that we had here, the color bars that we had, and so on and so on. Pretty simple simple result. There is not much that you get to configure. Actually, I could see if I created this detect first page correctly, equal to 1, and if I do test now, as you can see, I now have all objects removed on the first page, but on the second page they are still there. So that shows you that that works as well. And we could make it a little bit more complex or smart. You can call it the way you want, by saying, for example, I only want this to work on pages greater than 1, and let's do something something creative, less than 4. So greater than 1, that is starting with 2, and less than 4 means 2, 3. So basically I'm saying pages 2 and 3 if I got my my math correct. And if I run this test again, page 1 still has everything, page 2 doesn't have anything, page 3 doesn't have anything, and page 4 again has all the stuff. So it did indeed remove objects for pages 2 and 3. If you haven't used this apply to, it can actually be very useful in workflows when you try to figure out how to accomplish things on certain pages. You do not have this in all Fixups in pdfToolbox, but with every release it's actually added to more and more Fixups. So if you want to configure something to work on a specific page or page range, this is a good way of doing that. And this check that I made that uses the sequential page number filter or condition is a very nice one to use in conjunction with that. So that's the first way. It's using the built-in fix, but I will show you some other way of doing this. And the other way is by using remove objects. Remove objects is a generic fix-up that allows you to remove, well, objects from a document. And which objects it is going to remove is determined by, again, a preflight check. And that is where the big advantage lies in this check when you compare it to the previous one, is that in the previous one it is always going to remove everything outside the trim box. Yeah? And I've rebuilt that here. So if we say tests, I get exactly the same result. But of course we could try to be smarter about that, and we could say, well, I don't want to remove all objects. Maybe I only want to remove objects that are black. The previous way I showed you has no way of accomplishing that. It's always going to be everything. But here we work with a preflight check. So we can be a little bit smarter than that. And I can say duplicate, detect objects outside trim box that are black. This is very bad English, I think, but you understand what I'm trying to do here. And if I'm not mistaken, we have a condition that is called something with black. Let's see, object is 100% black. That sounds like what we're looking for. So now I have a condition that says object is outside of trim box. By default, there is an and, a logical and in between these conditions. So I'm only going to select objects that are outside of the trim box and that are 100% black. I have that selected, and if we now do test, I've actually not tried this ahead of time, so I'm very curious what's going to happen. Nothing much seems to happen actually. So you see what the problem is, and the problem is that we would now have to figure out why these objects are not selected, and it's probably because the color definition that we have here makes them not 100% black. And actually I think I already know why. These objects that we have here are designed to be on a outside of the trim box, so they're designed to be on all separations. So if we look at these objects, it will tell you that it is using a separation color, and that separation color is a registration color, so it's a separation color that is that the name is all, and that is not detected as 100% black in that check that I used, simply because typically that's not what you want. So we did the wrong condition here, and I think we have one that says is registration color. So if we remove that one and we add this one, we can test again and see what happens now. And now you can see that everything that is that registration color black disappears, which is logically just about everything outside of the trim box, with the exception of our nice colored patches there, because those obviously are not registration color, they are in some kind of other color. Yeah. So very much the same principle as what we did in the built-in Fixup, but because we have a capability of writing our own preflight checks here, we can be more discriminating about what we are going to remove and what can remain. Another way of using this in a workflow perhaps would be I only want to remove the text that is outside the trim box, or maybe I want to keep the text but I want to remove the trim marks, so I'm going to remove everything in separation color that is not text. You can get as creative as you want, but well, you need to use remove objects and then write a preflight check to accomplish that. Of course, this remove objects can be used for much more than simply removing everything outside of the trim box. You could also remove particular spot colors, you could remove images, you could remove all text from a document. It is, well, a very flexible way of removing objects from a document according to what you need in a particular workflow. Now, the last example I have here does something very similar, but it uses a different preflight check. And the reason it uses that particular preflight check is because in this case the preflight check uses Sifter. Now, if you haven't looked at any of the pdfToolbox 10 webinars, you're not going to know what Sifter is. In that case, I would encourage you to actually look into that. It's a very cool technology in pdfToolbox 10. You find all of the conditions for that in this group, context-aware object detection, where you find the master Sifter condition. This is the one where you can customize all the properties and so on. And then you find a number of easy to use conditions. And those make it easy, for example, to detect things that are outside a shape. And that's exactly what I've been using here. So the condition is object outside shape. Which object do I want to detect? Well, any page object in this case, but again we're using a preflight check. So if I wanted to confine this to only those objects that are using a particular spot color, or only those objects that are using registration color, or any of those, then I could actually do that again by modifying this preflight check. And then the second thing is that I'm looking at objects outside of a shape. That shape is created by using a preflight check that uses this shape definition. And if I open what I have here, you can see that. So it uses the special condition shape definition. And the shape is very similar to what I used in that shapes fix-up to highlight the trim box before. So I did the simple thing again, so from trim box, but again I could adjust things and remove stuff that is outside, like more than 5 millimeters outside of the trim box, or maybe inside of the trim box and close to the trim box. I can adjust this by using the shape parameters again. What does this one do? Well, it does something that is in the way I've configured it is exactly the same as the other check, or Fixup. The reason I wanted to add this Fixup to my list is because there are so many more things that you can do with Sifter. If you look at these Sifter conditions again, instead of using objects outside of shape, for example, I could also use object crosses shape. An object crosses shape means detect every object that starts outside that shape area and then is also inside. So it really crosses over the border of that particular shape object. And that's something that is much more difficult to do with the more classic Fixup that I showed you before, but once you start looking at Sifter, those things become possible. You can also use Sifter, but then we're deviating a little bit of the topic that we're discussing here, but you could also use Sifter to, for example, detect objects that are invisible, and use that to, instead of removing objects outside of the trim box, remove all objects that are invisible. So Sifter gives you gives you a lot more capabilities of detecting specific objects, especially when those objects are taken into account with when relationships with other objects are taken into account. So and I'll show you, I'm not going to continue that sentence, I will show you another use of that technology in just a second. So we've seen two ways of highlighting the trim box or any other page box. I've shown you three different ways of removing all objects out of that trim box, but sometimes that's not exactly what you want to do. And so I've added two more topics that come very close to this question. The first one has to do with a question that is more on the proofing side. What if I don't really want to remove objects? It's not important that they are gone, but I want to clip everything that is outside a certain area. And of course, that's not always the same thing. If I here remove everything outside the trim box, then I am simply going to get everything inside the trim box. But if I would have objects that bleed, the bleed would still be shown. And sometimes you want to show your customer, for example, how that piece is going to look when it's printed. And in that case, you don't want to show the bleed because that would be confusing. So how do I clip something to a page box? Well, luckily, you've already seen the answer. The answer is that you can use this create and apply shapes technology again, because it can also be used for clipping. And in this example, I'm actually using the same setup, and I'm going to do exactly the same as what I did before. So I'm going to give it a rounded corner. And then the difference here in this Fixup is in the apply shapes part. In apply shapes, what we did before is we said a stroked and filled shape in front of the current page content. That is what we did before to highlight the trim box. Now I'm saying clip existing page content. And that actually means that the shape that we're defining here will be used as a clipping mask to clip everything outside of that shape. How does that look? Well, it looks like this. Yeah? So I have the trim box. I have the rounded corners that we were looking at. Our shape is not visible. It is just used as a clipping mask for the document that we have. So the document has not changed in size. The objects outside are not gone, they're still there, they're simply clipped away. So that's another possibility that you have. It's not the same as removing objects outside of a page box, but it is a very useful tool to use specifically, for example, in a proofing workflow where you want to show the customer exactly what is going to be printed. Okay. And then as a last topic, even though again we're going a little bit further than what we've been talking about, this stuff about removing objects outside of the trim box is all very cute, but of course it's not very complicated. The trim box is a rectangle, and we're simply throwing away everything outside of that rectangle. What if my document is more complex? And I have, for example, this. I have a label, and that label contains a, let me show individual separations there. That label contains a cut line, and if we look at the cut line separation, then we see very well defined cut line. So what if I want to, instead of removing outside of the trim box, remove everything outside of the cut line? And why would I want to do that? Well, maybe because I want to do a step and repeat or a nesting, and I need a proper input file for my nesting application. So I want to look at the vector elements that define the cut path or the die for that particular label, and I want to throw away this stupid stuff that some person left behind. How do I do that? Well, obviously you do not do that with any of these, because all of what we've seen so far used a rectangular area, specifically the trim box. But we can still use the same principle. I can say apply only to objects identified by a check. That's the same thing we did here for the trim box. However, this time my preflight check is detect objects outside cutline. So the question is, how have we built that preflight check? And if you look at the preflight check, you'll see that again I'm using Sifter, and this is where the real power of Sifter comes to the front. I'm using objects outside shape again. In the example we showed before, my shape definition was the trim box. Now I'm saying shape of cutline. And if I open that one, it tells me that the shape in this case has been defined from vector paths. Which vector paths? Well, this gets a little bit complex. I'm 4 levels deep by now, so try to hang on here. This is the definition of which vector paths we're using, and it says here detect objects using a spot color cut line. This again is just a preflight check, and the preflight check says spot color name equal to cut line. So basically I am defining a shape that is only looking at objects using spot color cut line, and that shape is used inside of the Sifter check object outside shape. So imagine what's going on here. Sifter is going to find all objects that use a spot color called cutline. It is going to create a shape out of that, and the shape will be the same, well, basic shape as what you see here on screen, and everything inside. That's the shape that we're working with. And then I have a fix that says remove all objects that are outside of that shape. Yeah? And what happens when I do that? Well, this is what happens. Yeah? Now, you still have the bleed. Why? Because we're using a Sifter check that selects objects that are completely outside of a particular shape. So only if they are completely outside, they are deleted. And these objects around the shape, so the bleed that you have, those are all objects that are both inside and outside the shape. If I would use the other Sifter condition that I've briefly talked about, crosses shape, then these objects would be deleted because they go from outside to inside, so they actually cross the shape surface. Yeah. So exactly the same technology as what we used before. It still uses this apply filter in remove objects, but because we now use Sifter technology to figure out which objects are outside, completely outside a cut line, it filters out all of those objects and deletes them from our document. Okay, this is about what I wanted to share. If so far I think there aren't any questions that have not been answered. If you have any more questions, then feel free to still enter them into the GoToWebinar control panel. A brief recapitulation of what we've done. So there are multiple technologies in pdfToolbox that allow you to work with page boxes, and they allow you to either highlight a page box, and that could be just a line, or it could be the line and the interior, or it could be only two sides of a page box and nothing else. So you can, in a very flexible way, draw page box identification lines, let's put it that way, on top of a PDF document. Then we looked at 3 different ways of removing objects outside of a page box, the built-in Fixup, and then using remove objects and using a proper preflight check to identify the objects, either without Sifter or with Sifter. We also looked at clipping, if that's what you want to do. If you don't want to really remove the objects but only have them gone visually, then that is a possibility as well. And as a last bonus, we also looked at the cases where you don't really want to work with a trim box that is rectangular, but you have files that have an irregular shape. And it doesn't have to be label, of course. This could also very well apply to packaging files and so on. And in that case, we can use Sifter, which, as I said in the beginning, would require pdfToolbox 10 to handle correctly. You can use Sifter to determine which objects are completely inside, completely outside, crossing a shape. You could also use this to find invisible objects, so stuff that is underneath other objects or things that are clipped away completely. All of those things can be used to work with irregular shapes as well. Okay, very well, then I will just scroll to the last page here to tell you that if there is anything in terms of questions about this, or if you have specific workflow questions where you haven't really gotten an answer during this webinar, feel free to send me an email. You can also reach us at the normal support email address, and that would be support@callassoftware.com or support@4ps.com. And then I think I am at the end of what I wanted to share so far. Maybe one last thing for the very brave Swedish person who is still here. It's still 0-0 in the football match, Kent, so nothing is lost yet. Nothing is won yet either, but there is still hope. Okay, that's it for me in this webinar. Thank you very much for joining.